Thank you very much, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I think one of the questions that you always have to ask is, why is Iran seeking nuclear capability? And there are many reasons that are non-military: prestige, intimidation, the ability to create an image of power, status. All of these things are important. But the title of this panel is not simply the agreement, it is essentially the regional balance of power as well. And from an Iranian viewpoint, you also have to see a country which not only has ambitions, but to some extent sees itself as under siege. It sees a steadily expanding and improving U.S. capability. It sees a nuclear-armed Israel with a large force of far more advanced nuclear-armed missiles than Iran can deploy within the foreseeable future. It sees a buildup in the Gulf. To some extent, it has tensions with Pakistan over Baluchistan, and it is a nuclear-armed Pakistan. It has uncertainties as to the future of Afghanistan. It is caught up in a struggle that keeps growing between Sunnis and Shiites, and where Islamic extremism from an Iranian viewpoint is Sunni extremism for obvious reasons. It has advantages in Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, but they are all unstable and uncertain. And quite frankly, these are not proxies. It is a contest in every case as to who can use whom and to what advantage. And then finally, there is the problem of internal security. Now, I'm going to race through some assessments of the balance. They will be on the conference website. You do not have to memorize them as I go through each slide, but I think they do add up to explaining some aspects of Iran's capabilities. I don't talk about intentions because I can't read the minds of Iranians. They obviously deny any interest in nuclear weapons, but what I can say is that virtually everything I'm going to show you shows up in some form in Iranian literature, not simply in terms of what you will see here. The U.S. role in the Gulf, I talked about that yesterday. I'm not going to vastly repeat it, but the fact is that the United States is steadily improving its forward deployment capabilities. It has increased its forces in the region. It has massive advantages over Iran in areas like space systems, intelligence assets, and it is deploying not only stealth, but it has the option, which it has offered the Arab Gulf states, of the same kind of extended deterrence that it once offered to Europe. What is also critical is that you don't measure the threat to Iran in terms of forward deployed forces. You measure it in the ability of the United States to rapidly deploy a massive pool of aircraft. And if you look in the lower left-hand corner, you'll see that you also are beginning to see major deployments of stealth aircraft. And while it isn't always publicized, the F-22 is a precision strike stealth system. It is not simply an air superiority fighter. You have a major pool of U.S. naval forces, and people often focus on our carriers, and it's rather interesting they should do so when many of the obvious plans and contingency capabilities the U.S. has are largely cruise missiles, which offer precision strike capabilities at very long ranges and with very proven reliability. We have limits in land forces, and these would affect potentially a threat cutting through Iraq against Kuwait. But one has to be careful, because Iran, for all of its forces, is not a force that generally practices or has high capabilities in projecting maneuver warfare forces. One advantage Iraq does have is the U.S. action in the 2003 war. If you look to the left, you see that at one point Iraq had a major superiority to Iran. Today, you see that that superiority is gone. But one problem with that is it also opens up the capability of groups like ISIL to operate in the west of Iraq, and quite frankly, the Iraqi performance to date in the north and in the west has been terrible. It has simply been a force which has shown the end result of corruption, political polarization, and growing problems. Now, this is something that will not be as familiar to you as many of the other numbers. And I have to stress, estimates of comparative defense spending are filled with uncertainty and error. But in very simple terms, the blue line is the total spending of the Gulf Cooperation Council over time. There's no U.S. forces shown here, or U.S. expenditure. The yellow line is Saudi Arabia alone. That, along with the UAE, is important because these are the most coherent forces within the GCC. And that red line is Iran. Now, these are IISS estimates. CIPRI figures are very similar. They actually give the GCC more of an advantage, and they dramatize the degree to which Saudi Arabia and the UAE have massively more resources to bring to bear than Iran does. That's the blue and the red line, where Iran is that pale blue line. These figures are much harder. These are declassified U.S. intelligence estimates, and it is 2013, not 2023. I apologize. These are recent arms delivery estimates. They include military technology and indirect imports, but not the nuclear dimension. In the far left hand is the Iranian figure. In the far right is the total for the Gulf Cooperation Council, and then you see the transfers that are going to Saudi Arabia alone. That's deliveries. This is new agreements. And you can see the disparity is far greater. And these dollars buy for the Gulf states the most modern military equipment available. Iran faces massive problems even in getting parts for U.S. aircraft, much less more advanced combat systems. And what this doesn't show is that you have over $70 billion worth of additional U.S. arms deliveries to this region in the pipeline. And it does not reflect the fact that these deliveries are going to be far more coherent, far more shaped to mission capabilities than they have been in the past. Conventional balance. And this helps explain, in many ways, along with those other figures, why Iran has a nuclear incentive. That manpower shows in the far right a potential Iranian advantage, except most of it's false. It is an Iranian reserve system which is essentially worthless. For Israelis, reserves matter. For Iran, they are basically a political tool for internal security control. But there is a significant ground capability. The problem is, as Joby mentioned, I was in Iran in the early 1970s. So are some of these weapon systems. And weapon systems age in dog years. More than that, this land warfare inventory in large part had to be used through the Iran-Iraq war. It is not new or unused equipment, and it has suffered major burdens and problems. They do have in the red some more modern systems. Other systems are coming in, but frankly they have tended to lie through their teeth about their ability to produce modern combat equipment. And that's why when you look at the estimates of the numbers, they almost never reflect Iranian claims. Armor. The fact is that there are far more modern armored systems in Gulf forces, even if you ignore U.S. capabilities. Iran does have a lead in artillery, but a lot of this is slow-moving, towed equipment, which is very hard to support. It was bought for defensive purposes or to attack static Iraqi lines during the Iran-Iraq war, and it is not particularly effective, and it is not in units with modern artillery support by way of sensors, radars, and other counter-battery equipment. This is perhaps the key dimension. In terms of aircraft, as Israelis know very well, the United States constantly updates aircrafts through what is called the Multi-Stage Improvement Program. None of these aircraft have had any deliveries since 1979. The few Russian fighters they have are export versions, and while I can't get into the details, they have very serious performance limitations. And this is because of the way they were configured. Iran has tried to compensate. It's tried to find ways to work around the problems in its F-14 program. Again, a lot of the details would be classified, but the success, to put it mildly, is mixed. And what do they face? To be honest, to give them any modern aircraft, I had to lie a lot. F-4s and F-5s are not modern aircraft. Early versions of the MiG-29 or Su-24 are not modern aircraft. Chinese F-7s are not modern aircraft. And against that is an extremely effective force in the UAE and Saudi Arabia of Tornados, now Typhoons, and increasingly more sophisticated F-15s backed by modern airborne control and warning and far more advanced command and control assets supported by the United States. Iran faces the same problem with its surface-to-air missile systems. As I mentioned this morning, until they get the S-300 or the S-400, they have one very short-range modern system, the TOR-M. A lot of the rest are systems we broke decisively electronically and in counter-missile capabilities during the Vietnam War. They've upgraded radars, they've improved command and control, they've made some modifications, but this is essentially an obsolete force. And again, I won't walk you through all of these numbers, they'll be on the web. The Navy, the major surface Navy, is essentially, with some upgrades and very uncertain integration of the weapons, the same Navy we fought during the tanker war in 1987 and 1988 as major surface ships. But here we come gradually to the key element Iran has a decisive advantage in, and that is in the capability for asymmetric warfare. These numbers are not going to be easily visible to you, but what counts is that bar on the far right. One difference is Iran's naval readiness. They not only have ships designed for asymmetric warfare, they exercise, practice, and train. To be blunt, the Gulf navies don't. They are not effective in the southern Gulf, with the possible exception of the UAE. We have pressed for over a decade for the Saudis to modernize. It will not come as a shock to them if I criticize their progress. And the other countries, quite frankly, cannot afford to have large, effective forces. They've organized the Revolutionary Guard around the ability to attack in the Gulf. That is not at the Strait of Hormuz. And if anybody talks to you about this strait and doesn't talk about the rest of the Gulf or the Gulf of Oman, they are ignoring virtually every aspect of Iranian training, deployment, and exercises. Iran practices wars of attrition at very different levels of attack throughout the Gulf, in the Gulf of Oman, the Arabian Sea, and sometimes now in the approaches to the Indian Ocean. Look at that bar to the far left. These are small patrol ships. They are not by themselves highly threatening, but once you disperse them, and they can disperse them in a matter of hours to a wide range of areas in the Gulf, they're hard to find, hard to target, and they can threaten virtually any kind of commercial ship moving through the area. The problem, however, is fairly obvious. When you have this kind of strength, even when it is a matter of smart minds and other systems, you have to consider your vulnerabilities. Nobody has to fight a naval war in the Gulf if Iran escalates to the point of threatening world Gulf energy exports. This is a country dependent on 4 major refineries, of which 3 are important. It is a country whose power grid is something that can be removed in about 48 hours. Without going into the other major target problems that exist in the Gulf, when you have a massive air strike capability, this is a country which is extraordinarily vulnerable in using its assets to escalation. It also faces problems in its missiles, and I'll conclude with this. There is often a large focus on the long-range systems, but Iran keeps changing and modifying these systems. And while I have read people who talk about the CEP of these systems, the point made in the previous presentation is still critical. Until you have reliable, precision-guided systems, the accuracy figures you see in ordinary reporting are technology rubbish. A circular error of probability is the theoretical capability of a missile if it operates absolutely perfectly to its design specification 50% of the time. The other half go God knows where. In practice, if you want to deal with accuracy, you never use CEP. You use a term known as a derived aim point. That is the historically proven accuracy of the system. And so far, that accuracy is not only limited, but the lethality of the warheads is largely unitary conventional munitions, which at best can achieve about 60% of the blast impact of a conventional bomb with the same weight of high explosive. When you're off by half a kilometer or a kilometer, you can hurt a city, you can kill civilians, you can impose a terror weapon, as did, for example, Iraq in striking at Israel in the Gulf earlier. But here's the different story. Because everything you saw about the buildup of capabilities against Israel in terms of what's happening in Lebanon, in the Gaza, applies to this region as well. Those red lines are density. The darker the red, the more the systems there are. At this point, they can fire across the Gulf, and they are gradually acquiring systems with some degree of accuracy. But there is a radical difference between a ballistic missile with GPS and one with terminal guidance. In short, until they can put nuclear arms on these missiles, until they can create a far more lethal threat than they have today, these capabilities do not begin to offset the stealth and precision strike capabilities of Gulf and U.S. air power in this region in lethality or the ability to cripple infrastructure and critical military targets. There is a timing problem, but I want to conclude with this because it gives you an idea to some extent of where Iran stands. What they did was fire some missiles. Then they released a picture of where these missiles hit, and over it they drew an airfield. Now, it is very easy to hit the target if you bring the target to the bullet. And it is even easier if you draw the target over the crater. The problem is, this is a little bit of a liar's contest because as we began to really look at these photos, we found that a number of the craters were faked. They had actually gone in and had a number of explosions to make it look like a crater, and then they actually superimposed craters they didn't have over the photo they released. Now, if this sounds unusual, remember this is the same country which has released Photoshop versions of multiple missile launches and done so with some propaganda success. So let me make the key point here. This is a country that is a very real threat. Its threat extends, as you all know, into the Levant, and not only into Syria, but it has major influence in Iraq. Its asymmetric capabilities are very real, and it is building up its missile capabilities. But once you look at this balance, you see why they would want nuclear weapons. And quite frankly, I think looking at their history, They probably take their ability to influence and use power in the Gulf as a far more serious objective than they necessarily see attacks on Israel, particularly, and let's be blunt about this, a nuclear-armed Israel with far more capability and sophistication. Thank you very much.